Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is David Theroux. I'm the president of the C.S. Lewis Society of California. I want to welcome you to our event this evening. This is the second of two events we're hosting to discuss the enormously influential book, The City of God, the classic book in Christian philosophy by Saint Augustine of Hippo. Incidentally, the video of the first of the two sessions is now on our YouTube channel, and I hope you'll enjoy it. I think it came out quite well. Graham is even more handsome in the video than he is in person. It's pretty impressive. So for those of you new to our program, the C.S. Lewis Society is a nonprofit Christian educational and cultural organization. We're interested in advancing deeper understanding of the life, works, and ideas of C.S. Lewis and others who've been addressing the enduring issues of mankind. You're welcome to visit our website, lewissociety.org, for further information. You'll find a treasure trove of publications, events, and other programs, including the Lewis Society Book and Film Club, which this is a meeting of, and including upcoming meetings for the rest of this year. And we'll be posting the schedule for 2020 probably by December, if not earlier. On the website, you'll also find articles and videos and interviews. Virtually all of Lewis's books are available on the website, as well as CDs and DVDs, and information about similar work by others who have contributed to the same corpus of information. And we invite you to become a member of the C.S. Lewis Society. This is the giving season, and it's tax deductible, and that's how we fund these events and other things that we do. So, originally written in Latin and published in 426 AD, Augustine's book, The City of God, was written in response, as you may remember, to allegations that Christianity was responsible for the decline of Rome. It was written by one of the most influential church fathers, the City of God, who, by Augustine, who was a Roman. It's also one of numerous books by Augustine. For our two events on the book, we're delighted to have, again, Dr. Graham Walker to lead our discussions. Graham is the executive director of the Independent Institute. He received his PhD in public law and government from the University of Notre Dame, and his career has included being a professor at Catholic University of America and the University of Pennsylvania. He's been a visiting scholar at the Institute for Advanced Study, a senior research fellow, and still is senior research scholar, I should say, at the Witherspoon Institute. He's been a visiting scholar at AEI and many other positions, including a legislative aide to former Congressman David Stockman. He's also the author of two books that I recommend. One is called The Moral Foundations of Constitutional Thought, and the other is The Ethics of F.A. Hayek. So I'm very pleased to introduce Graham Walker.
Thank you, David. Well, it is my pleasure to see some of you again for the second time. That's always a good sign. I must have made some positive comment that made you want to come back. And for those who weren't here last time, welcome. And to those in our studio audience who are joining us through our video, we're glad for them to be watching us too. David Theroux gave us the basics of St. Augustine's biography. I mentioned last time a number of interesting details that I won't go into entirely this time, but just to remind you, born in Tagaste in North Africa, present-day Tunisia, I believe, spent most of his adulthood in Italy, young adulthood especially, when he was moving from being an ordinary rowdy pagan to being a devotee of Manichaeism, to being a devotee of Neoplatonism, to being a Christian and being a devotee of Jesus Christ. He was quite remarkable. We don't really know what he looked like. The statue is a guess, obviously. This is apparently the oldest known image of him in the Lateran Basilica in Rome from the 6th century. So not particularly photogenic. Botticelli made him a lot more attractive looking, and then Rubens really dressed him up. And we don't really know whether that's quite accurate. I suspect that this icon depicting his North African heritage might be possibly more likely to be close to what he really looked like. Hard to tell. Last time I mention to you that he is famous for a number of pithy sayings. These are amongst them. Crete ut intelligas, I believe in order that I may understand. Dubito ergo sum, I doubt, therefore I am, way before René Descartes. Faith-seeking understanding. All of these, taken together, put him in a certain kind of contrast with Tertullian, another and preceding great church father who may have veered off a bit, understood to be the one who said, I believe it because it's absurd or impossible, depending upon the renditions. Clearly, that's not how Augustine viewed Christianity. He saw within the biblical revelation and the person of Christ a key which unlocked the lock of many of the conundrums of ancient philosophy. And so his work is full, his Christian work is full of continual discourse back and forth between Christ, between the Hebrew Scriptures and then the New Testament Scriptures and the philosophers of his day. You read many of his works, including The City of God. You discover him going back and forth between prayer and praise and analysis, critique, polemics, extolling of the goodness of God, prayer, back into polemics and reasoning. It's all mixed together. He doesn't respect the modern dictum of separation of God and mind, if there is such a dictum. But certainly his mind was capacious and complex. Oftentimes I find people who say, oh, well, the Christian faith seems too simple. I mean, it doesn't make sense of the world. The world's too complicated. They never read Augustine. Well, they probably never read a lot of the great thinkers in the Christian tradition. In fact, they probably never read any of them if they said that. But nevertheless, he certainly is an exemplar of the complexity of the Christian mind. I like this modern library edition. This is an early version. I've lost the cover. I like it so much that the cover is coming off. But anyway, it's one of my favorites in here because they have it all marked up here. The Marcus Dodd's translation is my favorite. There are others, not surprisingly, but his has a certain classic quality to the English, which I suspect reflects the Latin. I'm not a Latin scholar, so I can't attest for that myself. So in the first session, we examined the earlier parts of this book, in which Augustine begins with this interaction over the question of whether Christianity was at fault for the decline and then ultimate fall of Rome. It hadn't fully fallen when he wrote the book. It had fallen to one of the sacks of Rome by some of the German so-called barbarians. But clearly Rome was on the way out, and indeed it was. Was Christianity to blame? He analyzed that problem and said, no, in fact, that the faults, the sins, the vices, the endemic vices of the Roman people and culture were to blame. And in fact, the presence of Christianity had mitigated the disaster. Interestingly enough, his point, of course, was taken up by others, as was the opposite point of view. But certainly from a certain historical perspective, what Christianity did was to transmit to the world some of the high points of Roman culture. Roman law went everywhere, and it didn't fully recede when the power of Rome receded. In fact, the power of the church transmitted then, many of the greatest accomplishments of Roman culture. Maybe some of the worser ones too. Who knows? Worse ones. He also described in his book his complex and interesting theory of the fall of man. Original sin being one of the doctrines of the Bible that he was very taken with because it reflected so clearly what he perceived to be the experience of mankind in the world and himself. This is an Albrecht Dürer block print, which I've just given you an inset of to illustrate the point. His doctrine of the fall and of original sin animates his entire work. Now, properly speaking, it animates his work along with the corresponding biblical doctrine of creation. You can't have a fall without creation because there's nothing to fall from unless there was a creation. And so Augustine's work is always animated by these twin themes. I pointed out to you that he described human nature in this way. This was something I shared in the previous session. It's one of the pithier parts of Book 14, where he says that man did not so fall away as to become absolutely nothing, but being turned towards himself, his being became more contracted than it was when he clave to him who supremely is. And that contraction of being is critical to his understanding of what happened to the human race how it works itself out in practice and where it's going. It has a lot to do with his doctrine of politics, which is where I'm headed tonight. Political philosophy is part of my academic, background. And so, while the book has many, many fabulous things in it, there's this really potent political part in the second half of the book that I'm going to try and unpack for you a bit. But it depends upon his theology, his philosophical and theological anthropology in particular, what happened to human nature when Adam and Eve turned away from God. A contraction of being is an interesting metaphor, because if you think about it, it means that whatever Adam and Eve were, as designed originally in their original proper selves, was reduced but not extinguished by the fall. Their original endowment, intellect, will, emotions, love, etc., is all still present, but in a shrunken form. It's partly what it was before. And of course, this is one of the many ways in which you can see parallels between the theology of C.S. Lewis and that of Saint Augustine. Lewis said at one point very insightfully that this is a good world gone bad that retains a memory of what it should have been. So human nature is, exhibit A of that idea. Human nature itself speaks to us of what it should have been, what it really was, what it really is intrinsically, and yet somehow has suffered this lack. So consequently, his doctrine of the two cities reflects this. Some were here before, so I would love for you to jump in if you remember the point here. This famous statement summarizes in some ways the whole book. Two cities, he says, have been formed by two loves. The earthly by the love of self, even to the contempt of God. The heavenly by the love of God, even to the contempt of self. The former, in a word, glories in itself, the latter in the Lord. Now, first of all, cities is itself a metaphor. We might render it perhaps more accurately for our minds now as citizenries, social groupings that have a kind of a common glue holding them together. Two citizenries, two polities in that sense, have been formed by two loves. Now, here's the question that I posed last time. Why didn't he simply say, one was formed by the love of self and the other by the love of God? Wouldn't that have been a much cleaner and more concise formulation? The heavenly city by the love of God and the earthly city by the love of self. Get rid of the excess verbiage, Augustine. And of course, he would say, no, not excess, because, and then so, why not? Why not excess verbiage? Why wouldn't the shorter version that I just gave you have been just as good, or not, if not better?
Well, he sets up like two formulas.
Mm-hmm.
The earthly by the love of self and the heavenly by the love of God. So it's like a logical thesis.
It's a polarity, clearly.
Yeah.
But why not just say what you said? Why add all these other, why these subordinate clauses? Yes.
Well, the subordinate clause of even to the contempt of God or even to the contempt of self shows the progression of what happens when you start following whichever love it is that you choose. Then there's a progress that ends up with contempt for that which you have deselected.
Right, quite right. A good word for our era, deselected. I pointed out that rarely, if ever, in this long book does Augustine use the terminology the city of God versus the city of man. There's one place where he has a reference, like he almost says it, but the main point is that he almost never uses the term city of man for the one polarity. There's the city of God versus what's the other city? Earthly city. Or the city of God and the city of the earth. But he doesn't juxtapose the city of God and the city of man. And this is related to the point that we're on. Why not? Some of you were here before.
In the ultimate manifestation of this heavenly city, you have both the love of God and the love of self coming to fruition.
Exactly. In other words, humanness is not the antithesis, different words. It's not the antithesis of the divine. Humanness is, in fact, related to the divine. Man, Adam and Eve were created in the image of God. And so the fullness of their being would not represent the antithesis of God, but rather it would be a reflection of it. And so it would be wrong to juxtapose the city of God and the city of man. Now, parenthetically, there are loads of writers in the Western tradition since Augustine who gave the book a cursory read, a cursory skim, and they say things like, as Augustine said when he compared the city of God with the city of man, blah, 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 blah. But actually, you will rarely, if ever, find city of man for this reason, because his doctrine of the fall is a doctrine of the fall from a good creation. And the good creation has not been eviscerated. It's been contracted, shrunken, vitiated.
Does he use the word for earth or man in Latin?
Earth. Yeah, terrestrial. It's the word terrestrial. So,
Mundi?
yes, mundi, right. Yeah, he does. As I say, there was one instance where he might have said something that seemed like sort of like that of man, but overall he doesn't. And the reason, I think, is this. So therefore, to really love yourself best, following the teachings of Christ, what would you do with yourself, according to Jesus? Yes?
Love God, love your neighbor as yourself?
Yes, and you would give up your life.
Yeah,
You give yourself up to Him. But when you do that, you're not getting rid of yourself. It turns out you're getting yourself back. And so this is why the love of self by itself wouldn't have been precise enough for him. He's a very precise thinker. It's the love of self even to the contempt of God. And then the love of God even to the contempt of self. That's the tough one. And in his own experience and in yours and mine, we experience situations where indeed, as I said before, it feels certainly, existentially maybe, that to love God properly may be to give up something that's like killing yourself. Your favorite thing, your favorite aspect of yourself. Jesus said, if your eye can cause you to sin, pluck it out, He was speaking metaphorically, but that doesn't make it an easy saying, because there are times when you have to take away something from yourself that just seems so intrinsic to who you are. You just can't stand it. My life is over if I have to give that up or get rid of that. But unless you're willing to love God, even if necessary, when to the extreme of being contempt of yourself, then you have to do it. So that's how he thinks of the two citizenries. Okay, so now, jumping ahead from the end of Book 14, where we just were, to the beginning of Book 15. In the beginning of Book 15, he talks about the earthly city and how it works and what its values are. That's how we would put it. He would say what things it loves. You already know that the earthly city is animated by a certain love, which is the love of, even to the...
love of self.
Yeah, love of self. Okay, so we know that much about the earthly city. That's what it loves most, love of self. But of course, there are various variations on the theme of love of self, right? The main thing is that he says here, the earthly city, which shall not be everlasting, for it will no longer be a city when it has been committed to the extreme penalty, has its good in this world. It has its good in this world. It loves the things of this world. It thinks that life, as we experience it temporally, is about itself rather than about itself and something higher than itself. Notice how I said that? I was trying to be Augustinian. The problem is thinking of this life as being sufficient unto itself, having its meaning with reference to itself, as opposed to having its meaning both with reference to itself and with reference to something higher. That's my Augustinian, structure that I'm trying to give you. But it has its good in this world as opposed to in the next world, in a different world, in another sphere. It has its good in itself, good in this world. Why does he say in that parentheses, it will no longer be a city when it has been committed to the extreme penalty? What's that about? Readers of C.S. Lewis, what's that about? Readers of The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis, what's that about? Somebody comment?
Because a city is a community, and when in the extreme penalty or hell, people will be separated from each other. There won't be relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in the Great Divorce, they just keep wandering off and off, on and on, isolated from each other. right? If there's
No overpopulation problem apparently in hell because people just keep just like expanding into separateness and more separateness. How horrible, really. Separated from God, but then because we're made in God's image, we're separated from other people too. And that separation is a fearful thing to contemplate. And so it won't be a city because it's going to be already human nature and human affairs are a shrunken or contracted version of their original design. The sinews and fibers will be pulled even further apart. And of course, whether human beings will cease to exist is a long contemplated question in Christian theology. It would seem not, based on a lot of biblical evidence, and probably to Augustine, he would say no, God never lets them completely go out of existence because there is eternal damnation. And you can't be eternally damned if you don't exist. That would be Augustine's thinking. That's a speculation. But as to the earthly citizenry, the earthly city, it has its good in this world and rejoices in it with such joy as such things can afford. Notice that interesting way of putting it. Does he sound wholly dismissive in that sentence? With such joy as such things can afford. Not wholly, kinda, but not wholly. Because in fact they can afford some joy. But as this, that is to say this world, the things of this world, is not a good which can discharge its devotees of all distresses, the city is often divided against itself by litigations, wars, quarrels, and such victories as are either life-destroying or short-lived. So there's something about living this life as if its meaning is only with reference to itself that tends to sort of, it pulls people together to a degree, but it gives them reason to fragment also and to fight. The things which this city desires cannot justly be said to be evil, for it is itself in its own kind better than all other human good. For it desires earthly peace for the sake of enjoying earthly goods, and it makes war in order to attain this peace. So the city doesn't desire evil things. Just like Adam and Eve didn't desire something evil when they sinned, they desired to have a great glory of goodness which was God's, but somehow for themselves. There was no evil thing to desire. And intrinsically, human beings, except in extreme cases, what they're wanting is not typically something evil. They're wanting something good, but it's not for them or in the wrong way or through the wrong means. Human nature is built such that it's hard to want something wholly evil. And generally speaking, people don't do it because of the way they're made. So even those who love self, even to contempt of God, they do desire things, but they're not evil things. And the thing it desires most notably, he says, is earthly peace. Because if you've got peace, then you can enjoy other things. I've got my text here, and I wanted to... Oh yeah, so earthly peace is a good thing. Without doubt the gift of God, he says. But if they neglect the better things of the heavenly city, which are secured by eternal victory and peace never ending, and so inordinately covet these present good things that they believe them to be the only desirable things, or love them better than those things which are believed to be better, if this be so, then it is necessary that misery follow and ever increase. But the love of peace reflects God's design. Now, the founder of the earthly city was a fratricide, and whom is he referring to?
Well, Cain and Abel.
A step further back, please. You're not wrong, but there's a deeper answer.
Cain and Abel.
Cain and Abel, right. He's speaking here of Cain and Abel. Overcome with envy, he slew his own brother, a citizen of the eternal city, and a sojourner on earth. Now, how we know that, it's hard to tell. If you read the passage in Genesis, it's pretty obscure what the deal with Abel was. I mean, you can see Cain's animosity when you read the text of Genesis, but understanding Abel's character is more a matter of reading into it than reading the text by itself. But still, certainly there's a great tradition that Abel was the one who wanted to worship God in an acceptable way, and Cain not. And he was animated by animosity and killed his brother. And then Cain went on to found the first city. And so it was sort of an archetype of the earthly city for Augustine. So, since that's how the earthly city got going, you might say, we cannot be surprised, says Augustine, that this first specimen, or as the Greeks say, archetype of crime, should long afterwards find a corresponding crime at the foundation of that city which was destined to reign over so many nations, and be the head of this earthly city of which we speak. And of course, he's speaking of which city at that point? He's speaking of Rome. Yeah, Rome. Rome. And thus, the founder of Rome was Romulus, who slew his brother Remus. But what's interesting about that is that unlike Abel and Cain, the problem here is that, according to Augustine, I'm reading a little bit from my text below me here, both of them desired to have the glory of founding the Roman Republic. And so neither wished the other to have the glory, but Romulus got the upper hand. And so what you don't see, it's not an exact parallel to Cain and Abel. It's actually an illustration of the earthly city on its own terms and how it handles conflict. It handles it fratricidally. So there can be murder done between the cities, but in this case it was within the one city, you might say, archetypally. And the fact that Romulus was celebrated as the founder of Rome is always a bit puzzling to me. Why didn't they brush that under the carpet? Somehow it seemed to be admired, or at least part of the glory of Rome from the foundation. So the quarrel then between Romulus and Remus shows how the earthly city is divided against itself. That which fell out between Cain and Abel illustrated the hatred that subsists between the two cities. And that's, again, Augustine's words. So in Book 15, he discusses a little bit the character of this human condition which is messed up so badly, illustrated by Cain killing Abel and then by Romulus killing Remus. There's a kind of sickliness. He calls the fallen condition a sickliness. Earlier he called it a contraction or a shrinkage. Here he calls it a sickness. It's an interesting, they're both interesting, they're both parallel, because you can tell, a sick person, you can tell that they're sick because you can tell what, health would be, and you can see the discrepancy between the health and the sickness. And so there's something about the sickliness that we suffer from. That's the way of thinking about sinfulness. It's a disobedience, he said, of which we spoke in the 14th book. The sickliness is the punishment of the first disobedience. It is therefore not nature, but vice. Very important phrase. Now he's speaking using classical philosophical terms here when he uses the term nature, in particular nature, not vice. Here he's actually using the word nature a little differently from the way that St. Paul uses the term nature in, for example, the first two chapters of Ephesians. It's therefore not nature but vice. And why does he say that moral sickliness is not nature? Why is moral sickliness not nature?
Because God made us good.
Yeah, very simple, exactly. God made us good. God made us good, yeah. So when he himself aids the soul in his own hidden and wonderful ways, then the soul is converted from its own evil and selfish desires, and God possessing it, it possesses itself. In peace, even in this life and afterwards, when with perfected health and endowed with immortality, will reign without sin and peace everlasting. He never loses sight of the consummation and perfection of all things, while he's looking at the sickliness and distortion of things presently. I love the formulation about when God possesses the soul, then the soul possesses itself. That's why we were talking before about, what would it mean to love self properly. It doesn't require to go all the way to the contempt of God to love self properly, because when you love God, then, you let him possess your soul, then your soul possesses itself. And in fact, as Augustine has said in those chapters we looked at previously, one of the great problems of the sinful condition is the fact that human beings lose the power to control themselves. They lose the ability to have the reason control the body when they don't allow God to control the soul. So there's this cascading loss of control, you might say. I just want to not have God in the picture. I just want to be self-contained. I want to be autonomous. I want to be a self-law-giving person, we say. But it turns out that we don't even have the ability to be law-giving to ourselves, because we have all this unruliness within ourselves that just won't cooperate, even with our own best efforts. So, thus, we need God to have us so that we can have ourselves. So the flesh is to be healed from the sickliness. Remember, the sickliness to be healed because it belongs to ourselves. It is not to be abandoned to destruction as if it were alien to our nature. When he says the flesh is to be healed, to what is he referring?
I would think he's referring to the human soul or spirit.
But he
uses the word flesh.
Well, he's literally using the word flesh, though. It is to be healed because it belongs to ourselves, not abandoned. In other words, he's not talking like one of those people who say, well, you know, someday we'll get this soul disentangled from this nasty old body and our souls will fly away free. He's not saying. That would be nice. He had thought that, but that's what he had escaped. Pardon me?
That's what he used to think.
Precisely. He used to think that. Mm-hmm. So if the flesh is to be healed, to what is he referring then? If not the salvation of the soul from the body, instead the salvation of the flesh how?
Resurrection body.
The resurrection of the body and the life everlasting, the last words of the Apostles' Creed. Right. The resurrection of the body. Moreover, it has another referent within the text itself. In an early part of the book, he had argued with some Christians, or putative Christians, who had said that it was so terrible when the barbarians came and sacked the city, and they went into some of the temples, or the churches rather, where there were some consecrated Christian virgins, and they abused them. Wouldn't it have been better, these people said, if we had killed them before the barbarians came? Because then they wouldn't have suffered this horrible indignity and literal pain and the horrible stuff that goes with all being victimized. Wouldn't it have been better if they had either committed suicide or we had killed them? And the same argument is made, he says, this is like in book 2, wouldn't it be better when babies are first baptized if we just slew them right then? But no. The flesh is to be healed because it's not to be abandoned as if it were alien to our nature. So he's affirming two things simultaneously here. He's affirming the goodness of like fixing ourselves physically with medicine or proper care or food or whatever, you know, there might be. And he's looking forward to the resurrection of the body. So it's a strange thing to think that these bodies, actually this actual body that I'm standing in is going to be resurrected. I'm hoping that there'll be a little upgrade in the process, but I'm not sure there will be. I mean, there'll be an upgrade to full, robust health, but I want it to be a little more, you know, photogenic possibly when that happens, and I'm still rooting for that. But the fact is that when Jesus was resurrected, and he was the archetype, right, the first fruits of them that slept, according to St. Paul, his body he was quite recognizable when he wanted to be. And in fact, even he bore the scars of his suffering, and they could see them and touch them. So it was clearly he who had been resurrected, and not just a ghost. Give me some food, he said, you know, et cetera, touch and see. They weren't touching, they were touching a physical man, the same physical man, although with a glorified aspect that was not fully understandable. So he may have been more than merely physical in his resurrection, but he was certainly fully physical in his resurrection. Thus, I conclude that we will be fully physical in our resurrection too if he's the prototype. So you'll look like you, I'll look like me, you know, for better or worse, but it'll be for better at that point, right? Everyone has his own unique...
Care.
Right, we won't care. Well, I don't know, we won't care. My guess is rather... my guess is that we will have the ability to see beauty where we are currently weak at seeing it, and be so overwhelmed by the distinctive beauty of each person's face, and there won't be a homely person in heaven, maybe not because their faces will change, but because our actual vision will get better.
Beholder.
Yeah, but because, in fact, there's a beauty there that we missed. Not because, you know, everyone's going to be smarmy in heaven, but because they'll actually be more astute in heaven. That's what I like to think. So, anyway, the flesh is not to be abandoned. He loves the flesh, the physicality of the flesh, because it's the vehicle for the supernatural. Okay, now, the two cities, they're together. In the 17th book, the city of God appears from my way of writing to have run its course alone, because he was talking about the heavenly city and the patriarchs and the apostles and so forth, and now he's turning to the earthly city. But his point is that it did not run its course alone in this age, for both cities in their course amid mankind, certainly experienced checkered times together, just as from the beginning. What a funny phrase. Checkered times. Why does he say checkered times? I assume it's a good translation from the Latin. I don't know the Latin, but why would one use the term checkered time?
Like intermingled.
Yes, that's right. Because you like a checkerboard. Yeah. And we use the term checkered in other ways too, don't we?
Like a checkered past.
A checkered past, exactly. Splotchy, here and there irregular, some good, some bad, difficult, good. Checkered is a great word because he could have said the two cities experienced continuous and utter radical animosity toward one another from the beginning of time until now. He could have said that, but instead he says checkered times. And again, this is reflecting the thing I keep harping on, which is that everything in Augustine reflects the combination of creation and fall, not just one or the other. If in fact it was just fall and everything was messed up, then they wouldn't have checkered, they would just have lousy times together, but they have checkered times together. Interesting. But they are together. And he says that the society of mortals spread through the earth everywhere and in the most diverse places, although bound together by a certain fellowship of our common nature, is yet for the most part divided against itself. And the strongest oppress the others because all follow after their own interests and lusts, while what is longed for either suffices for none or not for all, because it is not the very thing. The very thing that what? The very thing that people... How could you complete the thought?
It's not the very thing that people need.
Yeah, right. The very thing for which people were made, the very thing that people really most desire, yeah. But still, people are bound together by a certain fellowship of our common nature, right? It's an interesting fact that fraternality, that solidarity is writ into our nature in such a way that even in a shrunken condition, we still have it, and we're still drawn together. And yet there's divisions, too. So it's a difficult situation. There's this wonderful little side note here in Book 18 where he talks about how there have been men in other nations who belonged to the heaven, not by earthly but heavenly fellowship, to the true Israelites or to the heavenly city. He refers to Job, tells the story of Job, and he says, I doubt not it was divinely provided from this one case, Job, we might know that among other nations also there might be men pertaining to the spiritual Jerusalem who have lived according to God and have pleased him. And it is not to be supposed that this was granted to any, unless the one mediator between God and man, the man Jesus Christ, was divinely revealed to him. So what's he trying to say here? What's the point about other members of the heavenly city who aren't obvious? What does this mean, do you think? If they're not obviously members. They'd be obviously members if they were Jewish or if they're baptized Christians.
Yeah, he's trying to say that there were Christians before who weren't Israelites or who weren't Christians, like Plato and the noble Romans of the past. He thought participated in the spiritual fellowship that Christians participated in.
It's hard to tell, maybe, from his corpus as a whole, how far he went in incorporating literally Plato and literally some of the noble Romans, but that's the point. Job is like an example of the thing. But people who, they were Christians before they could be Christians. How can you be a Christian without naming the name of Christ? That's impossible. But he says not, because the thing that, what is his qualification? If they were Christians without being Christians, it was only because God did what to them?
The way I would put it is, they were numinously aware of him.
Okay, and whose business was that?
Well, it was his initiative, obviously,
yeah, right.
to allow them to be numinously aware of him.
Right. And so the one mediator between God and man was somehow, they somehow accessed the one mediator between God and man. So he's not violating what Peter said in Acts, neither is there salvation in any other, for there is no other name under heaven given among men whereby we must be saved. He's not violating that. He's not violating when Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. Only through Jesus, but through Jesus is a supple and complex phenomenon. And he looks backwards historically, and the implication is that the same thing could be true going forward. There might be people who, in fact, are somehow accessing connection to God in a salvific way through the mediation of Jesus Christ who don't realize it. How could that be? Okay, there's an example in C.S. Lewis of one such person character in a story. Can you know what I'm thinking of? What is it?
The Last Battle.
Yes, and the character is?
A citizen of
Kellerman.
A citizen of Kellerman, and his name was?
What was his name?
Does anybody remember his name? I know David Theroux remembers his name, but we won't let David say it. Somebody knows his name. So he walked through the door, and then he's sitting there dazed because he's in the presence of Aslan somehow. His name was Emeth. Emeth, yeah. And it was in The Last Battle, the final book of the Chronicles of Narnia. He, in his life, seemed to have been a devotee of the god of the Kellermans, whatever, who seemed to be kind of a dark and unfriendly personality. But Emeth, somehow, he was aspiring to the truly good and was resisting his own vices, and somehow he was in Aslan's country. And he wasn't, that people wouldn't have thought he was supposed to be, but there he was. So this is the kind of thing that Saint Augustine is thinking. Emeth, a fictional character, yes, but he was there because Aslan died for him, and somehow he loved Aslan without understanding that he loved him.
It might be oversimplifying it, but I have read in places that the capital A angel of God who appears in the Old Testament might have been some sort of manifestation of Jesus.
Some people say that, yeah. Pre-incarnation manifestation of the incarnation, yeah.
This is pretty radical.
It's quite radical. Well, it is and it isn't. I mean, Christians have thought this for centuries. I mean, I don't want to take too many millennia, but yeah, they've thought it a long time. It's actually the idea that the only way to have your eternal destiny secure is by a fully cognitive, self-conscious, rational affirmation of a certain 4 points written down in 1974 by Bill Bright. That thing is actually a new way of thinking about it.
Hey, I carried one of those in my wallet for years. Don't knock it.
They were good. I like them too. Yeah, I like them too. But the point here is that the key thing is actually reliance upon the mediating Christ. And that reliance might look like that, but I know people who said those 4 sentences, checked the box and wrote their name at the bottom of the page, who, from all I can tell, actually aren't relying on Christ and didn't, and it was just a thing, and, fell apart. And there are other people who, in fact, for what reason or another, it could be historical, it could be cognitive impairment, it could be family history, it could be that they had a bad father, they have trouble with the fully cognitive understanding, but I perceive from time to time a person who actually may be like what he's saying here, relying upon, inchoately, in a way they can't fully articulate, the one mediator between God and man, Jesus Christ. And so God understands those things, we don't. Now, is this saying, oh, everyone's going to heaven in the end? It definitely doesn't say that. If there are people who are inchoately relying upon Jesus, there are people who are inchoately rejecting Jesus. As well as consciously. And there are people who are consciously affirming Jesus. So what's the good of consciously affirming Jesus? The good of it is that if you think through what the Bible says and get sound teaching, it'll help your mind secure your soul. So why not think straight about it? I mean, that's a blessing, The fact that it's possible to wriggle through some cracks doesn't mean that it's not good to have a fully amplified, articulated understanding of the Orthodox faith and the creeds. It actually makes us stronger. It makes it even easier. It makes it better. It makes you more secure. But God is, complicated. Many people like to quote the saying from John chapter 3, "You must be born again," which is true. But then Jesus goes on to say, you hear the wind coming and blowing. It comes from one place, goes to another, and you don't know where it's coming from or whether it's going. It's like that with people who are born anew from the Holy Spirit. Most Christians who are active in evangelism don't like that verse because it sort of makes fuzzy what they'd like to make clear. That is to say, the work by which, the phenomenon by which a person comes to love and trust in Jesus actually is mysterious according to Jesus. It's not as simple as merely the 4 things or whatever. It's mysterious. And so, if so, so be it. But still, we have the truth has been made available to us in the Bible, so why not look at it? And why not capture it? Why not secure your soul by strengthening your mind? That's why Augustine said he's all about faith seeking understanding. So, the destinies of the two cities, the earthly and the heavenly. I must explain, so far as the limits of this work allow me, the reasonings by which men have attempted to make for themselves a happiness in this unhappy life. And he goes on to discuss the various philosophies: pleasure, self-denial, bodily pleasure, spiritual pleasure, altruism, hedonism, all the different isms. He explores them all here.
Talk about Stoicism?
Stoicism, for sure. Yeah. And I won't go there, but I'm just telling you, it's fun to read because he engages all these different alternative philosophies. He doesn't just say, oh, well, all I need is the Bible. And actually, he spends, years examining these other alternatives, even though he continually reaffirms the Bible.
Atheism? Does he discuss atheism?
I don't know where he discusses atheism. The answer's got to be yes in some way. He certainly discusses skepticism, which we discussed last time, the idea that we can't know anything, which is close to it. And he rejects it because it's self-contradictory. Again, he rejects comprehensive skepticism because it's self-contradictory. Dubito ergo sum. He doesn't reject comprehensive skepticism because it's not in the Bible. It's true it's not in the Bible, but his reason that he gives is not simply that it's not in the Bible, it's that it's self-contradictory. So, what does the heavenly city, the city of God, say about the supreme good and supreme evil? It says that life eternal is the supreme good and death eternal the supreme evil, and to obtain the one and escape the other we must live rightly. Thus the just lives by faith. For we do not as yet see our good. It's yet to be fully realized. The heavenly Jerusalem, which is the final instantiation of the heavenly city, has not yet descended from heaven to the realm of the visible, but will eventually.
Did Luther ever refer to that?
To what?
That phrase by Habakkuk?
Oh, yes, indeed. It was his favorite part of St. Paul. Just shall live by faith. Yeah, the Reformation was spawned by Paul's quotation of Habakkuk 2:4. And of course, this is a good reminder of Augustine's place in intellectual and theological history. These themes of the radicalness of sin, the radical dependence upon God's grace, the fact that faith is the way to access that grace and not by meriting it through your moral performance. All those themes from St. Paul, which are already present in Christ, articulated by St. Augustine. Luther was an Augustinian monk, learned the themes from Augustine, was frustrated with the church he saw around him. He gave birth then to the Reformation, which went astray in various ways from Augustine, obviously. Some people have said that the Reformation inwardly considered, I think this is a quote from Machen, yeah. The Reformation inwardly considered is the triumph of Augustine's theology over Augustine's ecclesiology. The Reformation inwardly considered, says Machen, I believe it is the triumph of Augustine's theology over his ecclesiology. Isn't that an interesting thought? You can see how that might well be. Anyway, so Calvin learned from Luther, Edwards learned from Calvin, Witherspoon learned from Edwards, Madison learned from Witherspoon, wrote the U.S. Constitution with these ideas of original sin in the background of his mind while he was writing them, etc., etc. Now, keep that in mind as we move forward into the political stuff. But that's the intellectual history in a total consolidated nutshell. He talks about the miseries of this life. It's pretty miserable. Even virtue itself, which is not among the primary objects of physical nature, but succeeds to them as a result of learning, though it holds the highest place among human goods. What is its occupation, save to wage perpetual war with vices, not those that are outside of us, but within, not other men's, but our own. So even virtue is so circumscribed compared to what it would have been without the fall. The job of virtue is to fight vice, your own vices. He calls it an intestine war, not because it has to do with your digestive system, but because it's an internal struggle. Your own efforts to virtue are fighting with your own unruliness. It's a war. But peace is desired by everybody. It is the end of our good. Peace is a good so great that even in this earthly and mortal life there is no word we hear with such pleasure, nothing we desire with such zest, or find to be more thoroughly gratifying than peace. There's a human attraction to peace. He argues in that section, interestingly, that in fact peace is so written into our nature that even the most savage animals, he says here, encompass their own species with a ring of protecting peace. They cohabit, beget, produce, suckle, and bring up their young, though very many of them are not gregarious but solitary, not like sheep, deer, pigeons, starling bees, but such as lions, foxes, eagles, bats. For what tigress does not gently purr over her cubs and lay aside her ferocity to fondle them, etc.? So how much more powerfully do the laws of man's nature move him to hold fellowship and maintain peace with all men so far as in him lies? Interesting point that he makes. However, when he seeks peace, man often seeks it through subjugating others, and that's the point of this part right here. He often seeks to cause others to come under his domination so that he can create a peaceful order that suits his liking or a group's liking. The use of force is always exercised with a view toward an eventual new kind of peace. Rarely does anyone aim at disorder as the end product. There are some anarchists who may think they do. But generally speaking, historically, even the most disruptive tyrants, even the most disruptive entrepreneurial innovators, they aren't really all about disruption. If you're all about disruption, you'd never settle in to make a profit, right? So this kind of mania about disruption is pretty silly these days, because all it really means is that you want to create a different equilibrium that will be better, more fruitful, more profitable, more peaceful.
Next generation of conformity.
Yeah, right. It's kind of funny. Everyone says, yeah, we want disruption, but it's just the new logo. And what it really means is, I want a different status quo. It's not that I don't want a status quo, because everyone gravitates towards some kind of peace. This is Augustine's point. So it is thus because of these phenomena that human beings are always gravitating towards some kind of peace, however abusively established. He says it is thus that pride in its perversity apes God. It abhors equality with other men under him, but instead of his rule seeks to impose a rule of its own upon its equals. It abhors, that is to say, the just peace of God, and loves its own unjust peace. But it cannot help loving peace of one kind or another. Why not? Human nature cannot help loving peace of one kind or another because...
It's the way we're built.
It's the way we're built. It's hardwired. Yeah.
And it harkens back to Eden.
It harkens back to Eden, exactly. Yeah, we have an appetite for Eden, maybe writ large. And that's why there are so many horrible movements in the world, because they feed on that very appetite, but promise to fulfill it by the use of physical force, politics, law, oppression, war, etc. But they feed on the appetite for the Edenic peace. So it cannot help, human nature cannot help loving peace of one kind or another. For there is no vice so clean contrary to nature that it obliterates even the faintest traces of nature. So by now you're with me. This theme is just over and over. It's the same theme, right? It's the same. I'm asking you that same question over and over again. I was told that teachers need to say the same thing about 6 times before it's 6. So he says it, hundreds of times. So he says the peace of unjust men is not worthy to be called peace in comparison with the peace of the just. And yet, this is always Augustine, and yet, even what is perverted must of necessity be in harmony with and in dependence on and in some part of the order of things, for otherwise it would have no existence at all. Yeah, isn't that something? So the peace of the celestial city is the perfectly ordered, harmonious enjoyment of God and of one another in God. The peace of all things is the tranquility of order. That's what we all have a natural appetite for, that kind of peace. But those who are without God have some tranquility of order, therefore some peace, he says here. And toward the bottom, he says, these natures cannot exist without peace of one kind or another. Any human society has to create a kind of peace somewhere. Even thieves create, pockets of lawfulness because they don't want to steal amongst themselves. Human beings can't not gravitate toward some kind of orderly peace, even if it be truncated and distorted. So peace is the thing. Everyone has a desire for peace. Now, they seek peace by dominating one another. Here's a famous statement that he makes about political dominion. He did not intend that his rational creature was made in his image should have dominion over anything but the irrational creation, not man over man, but man over the beasts. Okay, where's the word dominion being drawn from, do you think, in his imagination?
Genesis. From
Genesis. In fact, I should have said in literally the preceding text that I didn't quote, Genesis. And God gave Adam dominion. So the idea that man should have dominion over man is therefore at odds with God's original intention. Beyond question, it is a happier thing to be a slave of a man than of a lust. That's a funny thought. I'd rather be a slave of a lust than of a man, but he says the opposite, kind of like Christ also said. For even this very lust of ruling, or libido dominandi in Latin, to mention no others, lays waste men's hearts with the most ruthless dominion. So the lust of ruling is a famous Augustinian phrase that has echoed down through the ages. Political men, sometimes they're women, but typically men, right, historically, can be dominated by this libido. Not the usual libido that you're thinking of, but the libido dominandi. And the worst victims of the libido dominandi are whom, according to Augustine?
Yes. The ones who dominate.
Exactly.
Not the subjugated.
Mm-hmm. And that's, of course, it's not a new thought. Socrates had said it's better to suffer injustice than to commit it. So it's the same basic thought, you might say. But certainly the point here is that if you are exercising dominion, abusive, tyrannical control over other people, you're harming them, but you're harming yourself even more. Because by nature, as God first created us, no one is either the slave either of man or of sin. Earlier in the book, this is just a jump back, but it's a similar point, he had said back in book 4, justice being taken away, what are kingdoms but great robberies, he says. For what are robberies themselves but little kingdoms? Kind of a cynic. And of course, when you look at the rest of his work, he does argue very clearly that some kingdoms are better than others. Some political orders are better than others. The Republic was better than the Empire, for example, with the Romans.
Well, he qualifies it by saying, if justice has been taken away.
Correct. Yeah, he covered his thought there carefully. Yeah, he did. So now we get to Book 19, Chapter 17. And if someone asked you, I want to know what Augustine says about politics, you would say, and I always say, turn to 1917. So I have an extended section from Book 19, Chapter 17, right here. And I'm going to pause for a second. You can see I've highlighted the words both kinds of men and families in bold there. Here's how it goes. The families which do not live by faith seek their peace in the earthly advantages of this life, while the families which live by faith look for those eternal blessings which are promised and use as pilgrims such advantages of time and of earth as do not fascinate and divert them from God, but rather aid them to endure with greater ease and to keep down the number of those burdens of the corruptible body which weigh upon the soul. Thus, the things necessary for this mortal life are used by both kinds of men and families alike, but each has its own peculiar and widely different aim in using them. It's very different kinds of people, two different value system groups, if you want to use horrible modern terminology. They're comprised of people. Notice he uses the phrase men and families. It's very interesting that he says that, because what Augustine doesn't do is something that later thinkers drawing on him did do. They decided to say it's all about individuals. He says it's about men, persons, and families, both. He has a complex view of human nature that's not simply individualistic. So that explains in some ways the misuse of his doctrines later on. But the doctrines are very interesting because two kinds of people, they both need the same stuff in terms of temporal goods, but they have different aims. The earthly city, which does not live by faith, seeks an earthly peace. And the end it proposes in the well-ordered concord of civic obedience and rule is the combination of men's wills to attain the things which are helpful to this life. That's a definition of politics. Concord of civic obedience and rule. So that's what the earthly city seeks. It seeks an earthly peace. The heavenly city, or rather the part of it which sojourns on earth and lives by faith, makes use of this peace only because it must, until this mortal condition which necessitates it shall pass away. But it's not uninterested in the peace. The heavenly city is interested in the peace. It's interested in the same stuff, but only because it's waiting till this mortal condition shall pass away. Okay, again, parenthetically, you should be on to my tricks by now, but when he says mortal condition, does he mean when we finally get rid of these bodies and are just souls set free into the Ethernet? No. Because
he's waiting for the resurrection.
Right.
Ontology, right. He's not...
So the word mortal is actually used literally here. It's not this physical condition, it's this mortal condition. It's the mortality of the physical condition which we're suffering from. It's not the physical condition. So we use the word mortal to mean like physical or human. We misuse the word mortal. It has a literal meaning from, mort, death, right? Until this mortal condition shall pass away.
So he's saying that for the faithful, politics is just an instrumentality.
That's correct. But oftentimes for the unfaithful, it's an end in itself. And why is it an end in itself? Because they were made for this very high, glorious, attractive end of concord and perfect peace. But they blocked off the horizon how they might get the whole of it, but they still have the yearning for it. And so when they look at politics, they invest it with far more potency, aspiration, yearning than it can bear. The cup of Marxism holds the spiritual passions of the post-Christian world, but it can't really contain them. It makes use of them in a bad way. Okay, so then the heavenly city, so long as it lives like a captive and stranger in the earthly city. Now the earthly city is now being used sort of ambiguously to refer to like Rome, or a political order fully organized on simply human terms, mortal terms. Captive and stranger, though it has already received the promise of redemption and the gift of the Spirit as the earnest of it, makes no scruple to obey the laws of the earthly city, whereby the things necessary for the maintenance of this mortal life are administered. And thus, as this life is common to both cities, so there is a harmony between them in regard to what belongs to it. So, scruple. I probably should have bolded the word scruple. What does it say? Why does it say makes no scruple? What does that mean? Does that mean like it's really fussy and prudish? Has scruples? It makes no scruple to obey the laws.
Like conscientiousness, or...
Yes. So does the heavenly city obey or not obey the laws of the earthly city?
It obeys.
It says it obeys them, right. It makes no scruple to obey. In other words, it's not excessively fussily conscientious to avoid obeying the laws of the earthly city. Like, so Jesus, shall we pay taxes to this horrible Roman emperor who engages in unjust wars for exploitation of the periphery by the center? And then Jesus' answer to it is, to render to Caesar what Caesar's and to God what's God's. Wait, we wanted to know whether we should withhold our taxes from the military-industrial complex, and he doesn't answer that question because he doesn't need to care about it. Don't scruple about these things. Understand that a lot of things are necessary for the maintenance of this life. You share it with all different kinds of people, and so there's a harmony to a degree. But it has come to pass that the two cities could not have common laws of religion. So does that mean that the two cities should like pull themselves apart and create literal physical cities that are different from like a Christian city versus a non-Christian city? Is that what he's arguing here? You know it isn't, because why?
They're merged.
He's already said that they're entangled and live together. Exactly. So they're living together, they're sharing an interest in the common things of this life, especially earthly peace, but they can't have common laws of religion. This is sounding pretty modern, right? It should, because this is where modernity on these points came from, actually. There's these people living together with different value systems. They have a certain kind of, least common denominator of earthly interests, but they can't have common laws of religion because the heavenly city has been compelled in this matter to dissent, to become obnoxious to those who think differently and to stand the brunt of their anger and hatred and persecutions.
But he's also saying there shouldn't be a theocracy.
That's right. In fact, Augustine is famous in an earlier part of this book for arguing with the Christian writer whose name is on the tip of my tongue, Aurelius, perhaps? Is that a right name? Anyway, he argues with a fellow Christian philosopher who said that with Constantine's conversion, that we entered into Christian times. And Augustine very clearly expressed reservation about the concept of Christian times, because the idea of Christian times seemed to imply far more thoroughgoing redemption and virtue than seems possible in this fallen age. So he wasn't a fan of saying that, once the emperor is converted, we've entered into Christian times. He didn't really like that idea. What he did like was this idea of the cities living together, without common laws of religion, but together, and that's hard. This heavenly city then, while it sojourns on earth, calls citizens out of all nations and gathers together a society of pilgrims of all languages, not scrupling, there's that word again, about diversities in the manners, laws, and institutions whereby earthly peace is secured and maintained, but recognizing that however various these are, they all tend to one and the same end of earthly peace. It is therefore so far from rescinding and abolishing these diversities that it even preserves and adopts them, so long only as no hindrance to the worship of the true, supreme and true God is thus introduced. So, pausing there, this suggests that Christians, those who are members of the heavenly city, in some real sense, may be found in all sorts of different politically organized societies, because there's lots of different ways of manners, laws, and institutions. One nation does it one way, another nation does it another. It's not all that big a deal so long as it secures the peace and people can get along with one another. So there's not a teaching here that somehow the heavenly city has to figure out the exact right way to order the manners, laws, and institutions to get it right. Contrary to that, they don't scruple about the varieties of the ways of getting it right politically.
So it's not totalitarian?
No, it's definitely not. It's not a big deal. Don't look for, in other words, some formula. Make sure that you do it God's way. Now, the argument in ecclesiology is an interesting parallel but difference. In ecclesiology, there may be more warrant, both biblically and in Christian tradition, for arguments among Christians as to what's the right way to organize the church. Okay, maybe, maybe not. I think there's some ways are probably better than others. You can ask me my own views later, but I tend to think that there's a considerable degree of latitude in God's way of organizing the church, but not utter latitude. A kind of Catholicity, perhaps, but without total tight rules. That's my own view. But regardless, the point here is that whatever the truth may be about the church, he's talking about this mixed, complex society. Dare I call it a secular society? I think I would call it a secular society because he uses the word seculum, which literally means having to do with this age. And the word secular actually is not a dirty word when used in Augustine's vocabulary. He says we live in this age, there's another age coming. During this seculum, we do things in a secular way. Not the way we mean the word now, basically sort of coercive, publicly supported, enforced agnosticism or, whatever. That's not what he means. But rather in the sense that we don't insist that we get power organized to bring about perfection on earth. That's for another age. So we don't scruple about these varieties of ways of getting politics together. There's not a perfect political order, according to Augustine, insofar as it does the basic jobs of keeping the peace and keeping earthly peace and the necessary things of this life. Even the heavenly city, therefore, while in its state of pilgrimage, avails itself of the peace of earth and so far as it can, without injuring faith and godliness, notice the careful qualifications there, desires and maintains a common agreement among men regarding the acquisition of the necessaries of life, and makes this earthly peace bear upon the peace of heaven. This is the...
Do you think that Augustine would say when the secular society is doing something unjust, that those of the heavenly cities should speak up boldly against the injustice, correct it?
That's a long question in Christian political theology, which does go back to Augustine. It would seem that he would lean in that direction, but without giving, without enfranchising the agenda of getting everything perfect. Because if you're trying to get everything perfect, then you'd never get there. And he wants us to be... He's both an absolutist and a relativist at the same time. I mean, is he an absolutist or a relativist? Well, taken the way we usually mean the term, he's an absolutist, in the sense that ultimately there's one truth, one God, everything that's... But is he a relativist? Yes, he's a relativist, because the adaptation of those who love that true God to the circumstances of life is quite diverse. And he even makes relative moral judgments all the time. Did the Romans have virtues? They did have virtues. Remember Book 5. They were resplendent vices, but they were admirable. And God rewarded them for their resplendent vices. Remember that? That was so weird. So yes, he's a relativist, and then he makes relative moral judgments in the context of an absolute moral horizon. He's both. And again, it's not like, oh, he affirms there's both good and evil. Not at all. It's always good over evil. Augustine is an asymmetrical thinker, not a symmetrical thinker, if you follow my point. So here, this piece here is really the heart of what Augustine contributes to political thought. It's this business about maintaining a common agreement among men. Now, if you look at those words, you can see that the most important word is what in that bolded piece?
Twice.
Agreement?
Well, the thing being maintained is the agreement. So I would say probably the agreement word is more important than the maintained word, but whatever. Yes, maintaining the agreement, the common agreement. So there's something about people living together who differ spiritually in a radical way, that the earthly city seeks to maintain a common agreement. And that common agreement doesn't scruple about varieties of different ways you might organize laws and institutions, but it is common agreement. And so having political order based upon a common agreement is a really unique contribution to political thought. Now, it's not completely novel. If you look in the Bible, where do you see common agreements amongst groups of people?
Covenants?
Yeah.
In the church.
Well, not so much in the church. You don't really...
The early church in Acts 1.
Maybe there, although their sharing goods and houses seemed more of a spontaneity as opposed to the result of a forged agreement, like Holy Spirit-born spontaneity of sharing. I'm thinking of an earlier episode that was more, and someone said it a moment ago. Covenants, yeah, in the Old Testament. That the people of God, the Hebrews, would covenant together, repeatedly when they needed to, that we will follow God's command, we will form a people, and so forth. And of course, that's a different context because God had laid down not only moral laws, but social and legal and so forth for the Hebrew people they were supposed to follow. But they did so sometimes by means of these vast common agreements among the whole people. And so that idea of a common agreement does have an ancient heritage before Augustine, but he gives it new life here. It transmitted through the Reformation, ends up in...
Declaration of Independence.
Well, yeah, and before that the Mayflower Compact, and before that Magna Carta. This idea of a common agreement having to do with the things of this life. It's not about eternal life, it's not about heaven and hell, it's about the things of this life, but that common agreement needs to be forged and maintained, according to Augustine. And it inspired many different variations on the theme. Famous common agreement political philosophers include, obviously, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, The Social Contract, John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, not just the Puritans, but also these, more Aquinas. Yeah, you get this common agreement thing throughout, history. And so we're standing, we ourselves are benefiting from a form of political and social order that was nurtured by Augustine. It was plucked up, recalibrated, and presented to the world universally in Christian terms. And we are beneficiaries of this idea that there's a common agreement that needs to be maintained. And it's about penultimates, not about ultimates.
I think, in a way, and it's partly because of my own experience, I'll mention in a moment, I think, in a way, he's sort of throwing down an incentive to believers at this point to look for the areas of common agreement, to find the common ground, even with the secular society. And I've been blessed the last few years to be involved in a nonprofit, which it would take too long to go into the details, but which I believe is one of well, for me, the absolute best example of an organization which stands on a standard and a principle which is highly Christian, but yet has engaged with the secular forces in society who on paper should hate those people. And they've found ways to bring them together and sit around the table and find common tasks that they can both engage in. And it goes well beyond ideology and gets down to practical matters. It's a beautiful example of that, and I think that's exactly what he's talking about here.
That certainly seems like it would fit.
I'm just thinking about, are you aware of this book, The Benedict Option?
Oh, sure.
Which seems to be suggesting the opposite of that. Am I right?
Well, yes and no. It depends on whether the Benedict option has to do with creating residential faith communities or whether it has to do with creating sort of polities.
Right.
If it's just a kind of a cultural enclave, that's one thing. But if it's supposed to be at least a prototype of a new political order, that's a different thing.
So, okay, so he is distinguishing between a cultural...
Well, I'm distinguishing.
Okay.
I'm just thinking that when I think of the Benedict option, it could be that you could imagine what in fact occurred in the early medieval period. These enclaves were created that were for Christian discipleship, but they were in the context of a broader society which was secular in the sense that it wasn't theologically driven. Power was disaggregated, order was kept in the medieval period. The monasteries were not the policemen, and yet there were monasteries. So I can imagine a society that did have enclaves, had convents and monasteries, but which figured in the larger social order. The Benedictine monasteries throughout Europe really were part of the warp and woof of economic and social activity. And in England, the Benedictine monasteries, until Henry VIII did away with them, were very much part of the overall pattern of life. They were amongst the manners, laws, and institutions whereby earthly peace is secured, even though they had a core that was wholly spiritual. But the Benedictine monasteries were economic enterprises as well. So there's all sorts of different ways you could organize these things, and therefore the idea of a Benedict option, modern, it might be compatible. It depends on when you want to withdraw from society wholly or not wholly. Wholly, if it means wholly, then he's against it, because we're connected. We can't not have a common agreement. We can't not be commingled with other people. We have to be connected. So he says, miserable is the people which is alienated from God. So would it be fair to say, therefore, oh yeah, Augustine's cool with secularism? No, he says, miserable is the people which is alienated from God. Yet even this people has a peace of its own, which is not to be lightly esteemed, though indeed it shall not in the end enjoy it, because it makes no good use of it before the end. But it is our interest that it enjoy this peace meanwhile in this life, for as long as the two cities are commingled, we also enjoy the peace of Babylon. And then he quotes the prophet Jeremiah, speaking to the captives in Babylon, who counseled them to pray for Babylonia, saying, in the peace thereof you shall have peace, the temporal peace which the good and the wicked enjoy together. So when the Hebrews were captive in Babylon, some might have said, oh, you should hold up and resist and dissent and fight and so forth. But no, Jeremiah told them, pray for the peace of this horrible, ungodly city run by pagans on pagan terms. Because it wasn't all bad, and God was at work in the situation. It was just about politics, Sure, Babylonia had religious pretensions that were ridiculous and grandiose. But so long as you don't bow down and worship their gods, live together. Pray for them, in fact. Pray for the peace. Pray for the peace of the unholy Babylon. So let me pause there and just say, would it be accurate to say that Augustine's political ideas constitute the equivalent of secular pluralism? the equivalent of secular pluralism. Of the two words, one might be a little closer than the other.
I think he would see that as a subset of what he envisions.
Mm-hmm.
So he envisions something much bigger for the people of faith.
Mm-hmm.
But if we can enjoy this pluralism in peace together, it's a good thing.
Pluralism is a difficult word. You know, pluralism seems to be a doctrine.
Oh, an ideology.
An ideology or a doctrine which says that the most important thing is just to have variety of values. So he's not a pluralist and doesn't believe in pluralism. Does he believe in a plural society? Yes, he does. He's plural without being pluralistic. Does he believe in a secular society? No. But, on the other hand, what?
He recognizes it as existing.
Well, why doesn't he believe in...
If it's part of the common, I forgot the word, but you know, the common agreement, then yeah, but if you could move beyond secularism as your common agreement, all the better.
Yeah, all the better. So long, but not so much all the better as if you could like create the perfect political society and make Christian Times out of it. That would be an aspiration too far, you might say.
Too far, or I mean,
impossible to achieve.
Maybe impossible to achieve, but it's something to aspire to.
Oh, see, this is where I think the principles here would resist that. And here's how my argument would go. Aspiring to, through political means, to a perfection that cannot be achieved by political means sets you up to do great damage. Because it's not just that you're aiming for something high and you're getting partway there. You're aiming for something that cannot be achieved through the means you propose to use to get it.
I didn't mean to say that you would achieve through political means.
Oh, okay.
But if the heavenly city spread in such a way that the whole population had views more in line with the heavenly city, and that was the level of the common agreement, then that's better. You don't have to use force.
Better.
And so that would be the hope.
Right.
It may be practical. I mean, I must...
No, properly phrased, it may be possible, but look at this next quote, which actually bears on this. The peace which we enjoy in this life, whether common to all or peculiar to ourselves, is rather the solace of our misery than the positive enjoyment of felicity. Our very righteousness, too, though true insofar as it has respect to the true good, is yet in this life of such a kind that it consists rather in the remission of sins than in the perfecting of virtues. His idea of what are even those who are in the heavenly city, the degree of virtue that they're going to achieve existentially seems to be pretty qualified, and it's qualified by the persistent effects of what? Sin. Or more precisely, what kind of sin? Original, right, original sin. The persistent effects of original sin make him describe even the virtues of the heavenly city in these highly qualified terms. So consequently, in responding to your comment, it seems that his way of, his theology at least, would make it hard to imagine, not even hard to imagine, but impossible to aspire to, the idea that somehow if we only got enough saints together and they'd all have a high enough level of virtue that we could finally get to a political and social order in this age that was really super good and super just. But if really we're, even those who are good and who love the true God, basically they're good insofar as they're forgiven, but rather than being good insofar as they've achieved virtue, they don't sound like the raw material for too highfalutin a moral society.
Well, isn't that a totalitarian temptation?
Yes.
Is to build the perfect society?
Well, the totalitarian temptation specifically is to aspire to build a perfect society through temporal means. Politics, law, force. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Just a quick comment, even in certain Christian theological traditions, the millennial vision from the last book of canon Revelation, that regardless of how someone falls in interpreting that, this is the period of political, this kind of achievement of political blessedness, but it's only after the return, right? It's after the kind of ceasing of the temporal age, right? And then, but the drift can sometimes come into certain Christian traditions in this language that maybe this will happen by some magic formula of Christian thinking or behavior.
Some argue that the period before the Civil War in the United States, when the Great Awakening, of course, had raised many moral hopes because so many people had been positively influenced by the gospel, fed the fires of the wrong kind of perfectionism, precisely because there were many who believed in that theory of the millennium whereby we work hard and things get better and better and then Jesus comes. I forget what that view, that's post-millennialism, I think. That view was common at that time. That combined with the Methodist-inspired sanctification doctrines that were being preached in the Second Great Awakening led then to a kind of fervor which may have made the Civil War worse than it otherwise would have needed to be. To be honest, as someone influenced by Augustine's thought, I tend to shudder when I hear sung or sing the battle hymn of the Republic. It reminds me too much of Cromwell's psalm-singing armies, the Roundheads, who thought again that somehow if they could use the right power to the perfect vision of society because they had the Bible, that they could bring it. And so when Oliver Cromwell finally stood up in Parliament after having captured it, he is recorded as having said, Oliver Cromwell, I never thought I would see the day when Jesus Christ ruled directly in England, but now that day has come. Oliver Cromwell. Great exemplar of Puritan Christianity. So yeah, it would seem that Oliver Cromwell did not have an Augustinian view of the limitations of, the political order and what was necessary. He had something much more grand in view, which seemed odd for someone who believed so strongly in the doctrine of total depravity, but I don't quite understand how the psychology of that sort of thing might work. Go ahead.
I can see those arguments in regard to the peace that's common to all, so the building up of this society. But the one that is peculiar to ourselves, does he deny the possibility of partaking of the divine nature?
Oh, no.
So is not that more than simply the remission of sins?
It would seem so, yes. Yeah.
So it looks as though he's denying it there.
Well, yeah, it's a comparative statement. It is rather in the one thing than the other. Because there's other things in Augustine. He's a little slippery. If you took this alone, yeah, I would grant you that. But I think there's a little more scope for the Holy Spirit to generate, substantive virtue than this by itself might imply.
Don't you think that part of this is in response to his being attacked for defending the barbarians, essentially, implicitly?
Implicitly, yes.
This as an argument, because certainly the Decalogue argues that certain things should not be allowed, right? If they do, they need to be dealt with. And the natural law tradition is rooted in that. But he's sort of saying, let's not really worry about it too much.
Right. Yeah, don't scruple about the institutions whereby peace is preserved. Because some Christians can get all wound up about those. They should get wound up about other things, like their own sins, rather than wound up about getting politics and law just right, one might say.
So what would be a common agreement?
Common agreement.
90% of people say this is what the law of the land should be, 10% disagree?
It's up for discussion. Up for discussion. It would, what I would extract from this conceptually is that some kind of foster a consensus that seems operative, an operative consensus, which is not an arithmetic formula, but it's not meaningless either.
But do you see my point in asking the question? I wasn't looking for arithmetic precision.
You were looking for a number, though.
No, I was actually trying to use the number as to point out the flaw in the principle.
Oh, okay. Of agreement.
does the 90% have the right to override the 10%? If we say 10% is too large a group to be overridden, then is it 5%, or is it 1%, or is it 0.1%? How many people can dissent to lower the bar of the comment?
Right, we're on political theory proper now, and I'm not sure that I have the answer.
You wanted to go.
But I want to answer, because you said Madison had the original fall and Augustine in mind when they wrote the Constitution. So your question is very admirably answered by the Constitution of the United States when it is functioning at all properly, which at this present time I don't think it is.
Is the Constitution better than this Augustine, or is...
The Constitution is just one example of the plural of many ways that one can govern.
Right.
But the issue of what number is enough is decided by the rules of Congress, where we have representatives from every state that are elected, and the majority of them pass a law. So the Constitution answers the question of how many, a majority of, except for those things that require...
Well, even more importantly, to reinforce your point, and the earlier point about Madison, Madison says that if men were angels, no government would be necessary, but instead, since they're, vexing and oppressing each other, we create these complicated systems that juxtapose, federal versus state, and executive, legislative, and judicial against one another. And moreover, the Constitution has complex decision-making processes that are not simple democratic numbers, so that the president is selected by this complex system that takes into account both history and population. It's called the Electoral College. It takes both into account and has in a complex way of hybriding the decision-making process. And same thing with the Senate itself. There's a distillation of views. In the original system, of course, the senators were not chosen by popular election, which was a very good thing, actually, because it would have made local politics much more important. But anyway, when that was changed, it modified that a bit. But still, the senators, there's a kind of a complex decision-making formula that the Constitution gives it. It never gives us a simple democratic formula. And in fact, the one part of the U.S. Constitution, do you know this? This is trivia. There's one part of the U.S. Constitution which cannot be amended even by the amendment process. Do you know what that is?
The rules that govern the amendment process.
No. Cool. Well, that may be, but that's not literally what it says. The rules that govern the amendment process say that there's one thing that cannot be amended by the amendment process, and that is the equal suffrage of all the states in the Senate cannot be removed, even by the amendment process, without their consent, without the state's consent. So the equal weight of each state in the Senate, which is the most undemocratic feature of the Constitution, is the most deeply entrenched feature of the Constitution. How undemocratic is the American Constitution? That's terrible. But it's the most deeply entrenched part of the Constitution. And the reason for it is because the founders had a view of the kind of precariousness of political decision-making and the possibility of abuse and so forth. And they created complex decision-making processes, because they were chary about human nature. They created divided government because they were chary about human nature. They weren't scrupling about the institutions and laws whereby peace is secured, so they let there be all sorts of different states to have different kinds of arrangements about different things. Like what to do about religion in schools? Well, that's a state thing. Let them decide locally what they're... We've stopped allowing them to do so, but it used to be, all those kind of complicated moral things, those were held in the states. Let them have... We're not scrupling about the different ways the different states might maintain peace and whatever, good order through their laws. Again, the Americans have divested themselves of that feature of the Constitution because states now have to follow national rules on so many subjects. The Supreme Court has become a national school board and so forth. But still, the U.S. Constitution reflects this idea that human nature is such that we have to sort of baffle and barricade power lest it be abused. That's the basic point here. This is not a formula for a perfect state. It doesn't pretend to be. But it does lay down interesting principles, and I'm going to move to the last bit next, even though we're on Oh, yeah, and one last piece of this discussion is secularism. We asked, is he pluralistic? You remember the answer to that. He's plural. He likes plurality, but he doesn't necessarily advocate pluralism, that is to say, multiplicity of truths. Well, yeah, he's not a multiculturalist. He likes diversity more than of people, but not diversity of truth. So then, is he a secularist? I meant to get you to answer that one. Is he a pluralist? Well, yes and no, but is he a secularist? No. That's probably the best answer, because right now the word secularist means a person who thinks that this life is all there is and that we should just think about stuff in this life with reference to this life, not with reference to some... Yeah, that's what we mean by secularism now. So if that's what secularism means, he's not a secularist. But on another way, yes, Mark?
I was going to say the definition being also the state or the political common necessarily being non-religiously established.
Yeah.
How would you answer it that way? What would it?
Yeah. Well, in that case, he is a secularist. They can't have common laws of religion, but they live commingled. Like, what is that? Except for a kind of, but it's not secularism as a metaphysical doctrine. It's a very low kind of practicality thing. And secular, he's literally a secularist because the word secular means age. And he always talks about, in this age, there are constraints. Original sin being the biggest constraint. There are constraints in this age. Politics can only do so much in this age. This age has to have a certain kind of common agreement about peace in this age, but there's another age coming. So typically, a secularist nowadays doesn't say, there's another age coming. Secularists don't say that. So therefore, the first answer was the best answer now, but still, more subtly, he is a secularist, because he thinks there are different ages and they have different constraints, different qualities, yeah.
Well, the second part that you emboldened in that quote is the reason why I think he's a secularist. He's secular, excuse me. Because there's a common agreement, he's not saying the common agreement, but a common agreement, they would go with times and peoples.
That's right.
So that would be at the time.
Right. I don't know if any of you ever read Aristotle's work, The Politics. It's very interesting to compare here, because if you look at The Politics, the second half of it is all about the varieties of conditions where constitutions are implemented. He did empirical study, and his basic principle at the beginning of that section, Aristotle, is that we may have some idea about the best polity, the best political order, but it has to be the best in the circumstances, and the circumstances vary widely. So Aristotle, preceding, obviously, Augustine, had a similar thought about politics, that we have to look at all the varieties of circumstances and adapt to them, and not try and force the perfect state into any circumstance. I would say something about don't do nation building, but that would take me really too far astray, so I won't go there.
What about our previous worship of the Constitution?
When was that?
When was there the...
When was it worship?
Of the Constitution?
When was it worship?
Oh, a few minutes ago, there was...
I was admiring...
It's just so good. There was a lot of celebration of... the Constitution as it's written is...
I'll celebrate it even more if you want me to, precisely because it has such a low horizon. The Constitution has such low aspirations, and it's so practical. It doesn't have the grandiosity of so many other political orders, and that's why I think it's probably among the best available. But again, I would hardly absolutize it. That wasn't worship. There was a time probably in the late 1950s in public schools when it was worshipped, but it was a brief, fleeting moment. When I was growing up, the Constitution was not worshipped, it was burned. So that's because I grew up in Northern California. So. Okay, I have to come to the last little segment here. The cities are commingled. We're praying for the peace of Babylon. Our virtues are not being fully perfected yet. There's a long way to go. I'd like to close with this statement from Augustine, where he says, in that final peace, to which all our righteousness has reference, and for the sake of which it is maintained, as our nature shall enjoy a sound immortality and corruption, and shall have no more vices, and as we shall experience no resistance, either from ourselves or from others, it will not be necessary that reason should rule the vices which no longer exist, But God shall rule the man, and the soul shall rule the body, with a sweetness and facility suitable to the felicity of a life which is done with bondage. And this condition there shall be eternal, and we shall be assured of its eternity, and thus the peace of this blessedness and the blessedness of this peace shall be the supreme good. That's no secularist, at least not in our terms. So I'm going to pause there for a final comment from anybody, and then we do need to probably close up in a minute or two.
So I have a question.
Yes.
Okay, so how would you then compare Augustine to Aquinas as far as Aquinas's and subsequent writers in the natural law tradition who believe there was a more fine-tuned approach and that political authority should be, is just not that there are many different, Aquinas believed that there were similarly many different versions that could be adopted, but they were all subject to this natural law code, and that if political authority kept on abusing that code, steps should be taken to stop it, right? And institutions should be created to sort of enshrine that divine moral code as best as possible, to reflect it.
Right, and of course Aquinas quotes Augustine constantly, so he certainly regards himself as standing in the tradition with Augustine. My own study of both Aquinas and Augustine leads me to continue to notice the divergence between the two. In particular, it seems to me that for Aquinas, the doctrine of the fall, well, certainly present, because any Orthodox Christian teaches that there was a fall. You can't not teach that. So he did teach it. But his articulation of the consequences of it seems to be far less radical than Augustine's. Some people have gone so far as to say, and I think there's some word in the Summa that may warrant this, but that Thomas Aquinas says that nature is bruised by the fall. Whereas Augustine, well, what would he say? Certainly bruised, but more than bruised. Wounded, vitiated is a word he literally uses. Now, what he doesn't say is eviscerated. He doesn't say that. But the recognition of the sort of very profound, deep-rooted difficulties of the unruliness of human sinfulness doesn't fit well with Aquinas. And for that reason, there are sections in the Summa and in a couple of other books, which I've got up on my shelf upstairs. He argues that, Aquinas argues that the only limits on how close the political order can be made to conform to natural law, which is ultimately coterminous with divine law in the second tablet at least. He doesn't seem to propose any limits in principle. The limits are circumstantial, whereas Augustine proposes a limit in principle on how far you can go in a moralizing politics. For Aquinas, there are limits, but they are local, prudential, thus making me less comfortable with Aquinas than I am with Augustine. But my comfort, of course, is not the criterion of truth. Yes?
Following up on that, the shorthand of the school of Athens that Augustine's Neoplatonism and Aquinas is influenced by the rediscovery of
Aristotle. Mm-hmm.
Is that a fair assessment? That I know I've heard others to describe maybe these divergences or these nuances. Is that overblown?
It's probably overblown, but there's something helpful to it. Where I think it may be misleading is that you compare the Republic of Plato to the City of God. It's very different in terms of the political angle. Plato's understanding of the good seems to be not filtered through a doctrine of the fall, and that's the reason that Platonism is, I think, radically different from Augustinian Christianity, even though there are obvious similarities. Lewis thought of himself as some kind of a Platonist, but again, with a doctrine of the fall.
I was just wondering whether it's just a reflection of different temperaments. It always strikes me that Aquinas seems to be much less aware of the tendency to see. He seems to be much more optimistic about human nature.
Yeah, that's because nature is bruised rather than
But in his
vitiated.
personal life, he didn't deal with sin in the way that Augustine did.
Well,
He wasn't a hedonist.
he wasn't. Well, his parents tried to derail him, as you may know the story,
Yeah, and he valiantly.
and he valiantly resisted it. Yes, John.
I'm curious about your opinion of the difference between the city of God and utopia.
Thomas More's? I don't know enough about More to comment intelligently. Can you give us a thought?
Well, the view that Lewis and others had about More's book was that it's a satire, not unlike Swift. And I think that's probably true.
And some have argued, to go back to the other point, that the major middle section of the Republic of Plato is itself a kind of satire. He's pulling the wool over his interlocutors, who seem to be all excited about power. And so some people read the whole political part of Republic with a grain of salt too, which might, make a big difference.
Wouldn't it be fair to say that the Bill of Rights is kind of the embedding of natural law or divine law within this framework of settling disputes?
Yes, but only in a kind of, there's a slice of natural law given there. Because the Bill of Rights, well, at least the first...
There's some absolute law in the Bill of Rights.
The first
Points to it.
The first 9 amendments of the first 10 are all about the liberty entitlements of individuals primarily. And that's a slice of the natural law, but then there's more. So that's why when I look at the Constitution, I like to read it in order, the U.S. Constitution. That is, the preamble is there because it's a preamble, and it lists 6 things that the Constitution is trying to aim at. Justice, the general welfare, I should have tip of my tongue, and the last one being the blessings of liberty. So there are 6 purposes, including justice and the general welfare. And so to say that the purpose of the U.S. Constitution is to secure the individual rights of the first 9 amendments seems to fly in the face of the preamble. The Constitution is aiming for more than just making sure individuals don't lose their liberty entitlements, although important as that is. And of course, the
perfect union.
And a more perfect union, yeah, exactly, more perfect union. And that's an interesting point in this context, because Augustine has a kind of a complex view of varieties of systems that might work well. The U.S. Constitution seems complex too. In the modern era, in the 20th century, it's kind of paradoxical that many of the individual rights in the bill, in the first 9 amendments, have ended up being mechanisms by which the power of the central government was dramatically increased at the expense of the parts, so that individual rights became a tool for increasing centralized power, insofar as the central government becomes the patron saint, the patron protector of individual rights. It actually tends to undermine competing sources of power. And when competing sources of power undermine, they don't block each other as well. The one becomes supreme over the other, and that's not good if you are worried about original sin. Okay, one last comment and then we'll stop.
What is Augustine's opinion of Christian participation in politics? In other words, this common agreement that we're to accept and live under peacefully, but he wasn't living in a republic,
right?
So there wasn't much citizen participation in what that agreement was, I'm assuming. But yet today there supposedly is. So there's, from what you've described, it would seem to me that the Augustinian view is that Christians accept the common agreement and try to change the common agreement.
Improve it, but not toss it. Well, and also there's a section, I think it's either in Book 15 or Book 19, where Augustine says that if there are members of the heavenly city who have the prudence and capacity for public leadership, by all means will be the better off for it if they exercise that. So, but probably not if they operate like Oliver Cromwell did.
I want to especially thank Graham for both of these wonderful sessions. I think we all really enjoyed it and learned a great deal. So another round of applause for Graham. Thank you all for joining with us as well. Again, on our website, you'll see the schedule for the rest of this year. We'll be posting next year soon. So thank you and good night.
Okay, thank you.